Okay, welcome back to the Contrarians. We have got another Patreon suggested topic. Today it is the rise and fall of, don't call it hair metal, doggone it. It is glam metal. That's what we called it in the 1980s, back during the Metal Wars. You had to pick your side and fight to the death. You were either thrash or you were glam, and there was no quarter given in between those two camps. At the time, I was thrash, but I've mellowed a lot because I'm a lot older now, just like everybody who survived that period of time. So I'm going to start off with a little fact because I think you can really trace, well, I'm not going to go all the way to proto glam. You can start the glam metal era to a very specific date, and that's going to be November 26th, 1983. See if the panelists want to argue this point. That's when Quiet Riot's cover of Slade's Come On, Feel the Noise hit number 5 on the Billboard 200, and their album Metal Health hit number 1 on the Billboard 200. The first heavy metal album to hit number 1 on the Billboard 200, not the mainstream rock charts. That was a ghetto that nobody wanted to be stuck on. It was a crossover hit. Everybody bought it, and that opened the floodgates. And from then on, metal was king for the rest of the 80s. But not just any metal, it was glam metal. Because bands like Slayer and Megadeth and Metallica that were just getting rolling at that time, they couldn't get arrested in commercial venues, not for a few years. So, we're going to talk about the rise and fall of glam metal, maybe what makes glam metal, anything we want to talk about, really. We're going to start with our old friend and the man whose clothing is staring at me, Nick Esquire. Nick, what have you
Hey,
got?
Reed, how you doing? Thanks for having me. Yeah, well, I agree that I'm fine with 1983, late 83 as the sort of the beginning or the ascendancy of glam metal. Glam metal, as I lived through it as a youngster and then teenager, it had the components of the music in rock, but also a look. So it was two different things. And there was bands that and artists that adopted at least the look, and then quickly shed it as the 80s wore on. And then you saw bands starting to hemorrhage the music part of it too as the 80s wore on. Um, I would I'm really interested in the decline of glam metal, but I'll say this. I would say that by the end of the 80s, glam metal was in total free fall. And we think that, or it's been popularized that grunge and Nirvana destroyed hair metal. I don't agree. Stats don't bear that out. My experience doesn't bear that out, and I'm happy to discuss that, or and anyone chime in if you feel otherwise. But I think that Nirvana may have been the final nail on the coffin if you look at it that way, or perhaps the sprinkles on the cake if you look at it that way. If you didn't like glam metal, but grunge was a part of it, but there were other things that were happening as the 80s wore on that I think tells us that the glam movement didn't last as long as one thinks it did, even if you experienced it. The original the glam rock thing started in the early 70s. It only lasted, what, maybe 3 years? Bowie, T-Rex, Sweet, Slade, maybe, New York Dolls, maybe. And those bands, after Mott the Hoople, after an album cycle or two, and I know Bowie gets largely the credit with T-Rex, but they shed that. I mean, they moved away from it. And I think when it comes to the glam metal, it's largely the same too. I think that the look started shedding. Bands that adopted it, like the classic bands like Kiss adopted it, but it was gone after an album cycle or two. And by 87, it was gone for them. So, some of the bands that sort of soldiered on in it, that were at the top of the heap would be Poison. They were always considered a glam metal band and sort of shed their image as or that look, but they had it maybe about the longest. Maybe Motley Crue, but they got a tougher image. And there's a lot of things that were happening. So you had this rise and all these bands adopting not only the sound but the look. Dawkins and Kix and Kiss and let's say Slaughter and Cinderella, all those bands. But again, you see the parallel between that and the original glam movement. After an album cycle or two, Cinderella, the look's gone. Kiss, the look's gone. All those bands started shedding it. So that, in my opinion, around 89, I think that sort of form of music and as a fashion thing was in free fall. And we could play sociologists and anthropologists to figure out why that is. Why the music and the fashion didn't have legs. I've got a couple theories that just go beyond, new things came in, but it became a less happy time as the 80s wore on. There around 90, at least 89 or 90, there was a war in Iraq. There was a recession. Those kinds of things are happening. You had the AIDS epidemic that did not help that look. It was an androgynous look, I think. And, guys looking like girls, et cetera, and makeup and hair poofed out. You had that as the 80s wore on, you had bands that were looking tougher and tougher. And when you had the glam people, it looked kind of like light and fluffy and didn't make a lot of sense. And there was like no testosterone with it too, in a sense. And as a backdrop with the AIDS epidemic, I think that had something to do with it. And in my recollection, it was like glam metal almost became a rock. Then that was girls' music. As a guy, you didn't listen to that music anymore. That was girl stuff. And then what I saw, to jump around a bit, I saw that in you had second and then third generation bands that came and fourth generation bands. And I think the music became more and more derivative. So even though the fashion was evolving, the music seemed like it was not evolving, and it was sort of more of the same. So in my mind, even though they were somewhat popular, you have Warrants of the World and those kinds of bands, and then LA Guns and Faster Pussycat and a whole plethora of things. By 90, the new bands didn't really make much of a ripple. Like bands that I had to look up some of the names, like Tough and Pretty Boy Floyd and Roxgang at all. And it just became somewhat silly by then. And of course, then you did have this rise of a stripped down rock sound, and you did have things like glam coming, grunge coming to the fore, that look. But then he also had bands like Jane's Addiction, which was different, not glam. It was a different kind of sound. Yeah, you had Faith No More, which to me was almost like a bridge band. They had sort of a different sound too, and they were actually quite popular. I think they made, if I looked up and I remembered right, Epic was number 75 on the Billboard charts. I want to say it was in 89, which is kind of early. So you started seeing this evolution of bands and these other things starting to come. Living Color, right? So you have all these other new sounds and new bands coming into, and so when you start comparing these new sounds and new bands, and the heavier bands like Pantera and Slayer and Megadeth really getting in gear and becoming quite popular with the masses around 90, when you compare that with the glam stuff, it just really seemed passé and old, and it didn't make a lot of sense anymore, whether it's a fashion thing or a music thing. So feel free to. I'm done for now. You guys take it. I'll jump in. I'll be happy to argue, but those are sort of my main points, and I'm curious to hear what the rest of you have to say.
Okay, those are some good points. I think my preference is to kind of go around the horn once, let everybody make their points, and then if we've still got enough material for a free-for-all, we can have a bit of a free-for-all at the end. So let's move on to Tom. Tom, what have you got for us?
Sounds good. Thanks, Reed. Good to see you guys.
Good to see you.
This is an interesting topic. Nick just hit a lot of great points. And I'm probably going to be repeating some of his stuff, but essentially, one thing that hits me too is when I was thinking about this a lot is that, musical trends, they do come and go, and they do have their time. You think about like prog rock, in the 70s, it was like, it was just that was prog band after prog band, Yes, and Genesis and ELP, and they were just killing it in the 70s. And all of a sudden, by the end of the 70s, things just were changing, and it was like you couldn't just keep making Tales from Topographic Oceans. It wasn't going to, times were changing. And like Nick said, one of the bands that I thought of right away too is what I also thought of Jane's Addiction. I remember hearing I remember thinking music was changing when one of the guys that I roomed with in college, he had Jane's Addiction's first album, the Smashing Pumpkins' Gish came out. Like you said, Faith No More had that big song. Those are, like you mentioned, these bands. I mean, and you felt like, oh, this seems like different kind of music. And Cult's Personality, like you said, by Living Color. Things like that, where things were tougher and grittier, and people weren't, so it was like things were changing. But to get back to the beginning, I'm going to argue that one of the first bands maybe the band, okay, 83 is maybe when things really exploded, but I think it was building and building this glam metal thing from the success of Van Halen. I'm gonna go back to 78 when when Van Halen came on the scene and just steadily rose. And I don't know if you guys have read that book, but Van Halen Rising. There's a book called, and it's awesome. It's a really good book. I think it's their Noel Monk. I think it was their
Manager.
yeah, road manager, and he wrote a book and he talks about the rise of or maybe maybe I'm confusing them. I'm sorry. There were two different Van Halen books. Anyway, they talk about how Van Halen became, started doing, they were in Pasadena or whatever, and they were doing, backyard parties, and they just completely, and then they ended up at Gazzari's on Sunset Strip, and they got discovered there. And anyway, they ended up, by 1984, they were on top of the world, right? They were just huge, this huge band. And I think that they were the first to me that had that sort of template of, poppy, hooky songs done with heavy guitar hero in the band. The lead singer, David Lee Roth, is basing himself off of Jim Dandy from Black Oak, Arkansas, was his hero. And they would go to, sex stores on the Sunset Strip and buy clothing for their, and he's wearing assless pants and chaps, and he's doing these gymnastics on stage. And it was all about good times. I have good times, sex, and rock and roll. And then at the same, right about that time, the launch of MTV happens, right? In the early 80s. And all of a sudden it's all about it matters how you look and making a big impression on how you look. And I remember seeing a video for Looks That Kill by Motley Crue. And I was like, whoa, okay, these guys all look like women and they're rocking out. It's like very metalish sound, but they all have full makeup on and they all have the teased hair and the makeup.
If I can jump in, Tom, sorry.
Sure.
But I think, and you're probably going to hit my next point, but they're still in black.
Right. Mm-hmm.
They're still in black.
Good point. Absolutely. But there's women on there, I don't know. It's a lot of objectification of women and fire and explosions in the videos. I said, by the time you get to Poison, it takes it to cartoon levels with lightweight pop songs done in this heavy style. But I mean, Nothing But a Good Time, I was like, oh, come on, this is like a pop song. This is not metal anymore, really, to me. So anyway, I think that I'm going to trace it back to that, and people what happened was that was the template that people started following, and it just got more and more momentum. And you had bands like Quiet Riot, as you mentioned, Twisted Sister, Rat. I remember Round and Round by Rat was a big song. Warrant, all the W bands, Warrant, Winger, Whitesnake,
White Lion, exactly.
And what happened was they were all using the same. And I remember I watched a video with Dee Snider, and he said it became a formula that everyone was following. Everyone was using the same producers, the same video directors, the same. I mean, it just became very formulaic, one album after another. I do remember the Whitesnake album, 88, was humongous. But again, Here I Go Again is another sort of poppy, very poppy song. I mean, you could really take out the heavy guitars on that, and it's, Here I Go Again on My Own. I mean, it's like very poppy. So, and it was a huge song. But things, as Nick said, things were changing in the 80s slowly. As it turned late 80s, something was changing. And here's another story that I heard was Janie Lane of Warrant wrote. He went to Don Ayer, I guess I don't know what label it was, Columbia in New York, and he gave him the album, and Don said, "Well, that's great, but I need a single." He went home, wrote the song Cherry Pie that night, and Don said he didn't hear from him for 48 hours or something, and then he came back and said, "Oh, this is the song. This is the single. I like this song. This is it." And that became the big song on that album, and they had this huge success with it. But he said that by the time they toured that album, went back and made the next album, and they delivered the next album at the offices. And he said, when I went in the last time I was at Columbia, they had a huge thing of Cherry Pie, the huge cover on the wall. And he said when he went back for the second album, it was Alice in Chains' Dirt. Mm-hmm. And he said, "Uh-oh, there's something's changed, and this isn't good." And sure enough, he said that album didn't get half the promotion that the Cherry Pie did. Or he just didn't get that because it wasn't in vogue anymore. So I thought that was a great story to show the portent of things to come, that things were changing, and they were changing fast. And like you said, Nick, I agree with you. It's like, okay, a lot of people say grunge killed it, but I do think it's just one thing. I think grunge was one, like you said, maybe the final nail. It's just one extra thing that really gave it the knockout blow. Once Nirvana, Nevermind hit, it was all over. Because maybe they were still holding on. There was like, and there was that whole thing where Tesla and Extreme and Mr. Big, where they kind of went acoustic-y. They were doing sort of acoustic mellow songs. And that's sort of changing, and like you said, it wasn't the heavy stuff anymore. Anyway, I think that's about all I have to say. Those are all my notes for the rise and fall of glam metal. Oh, the last thing I'll say is that, like you said, that glam rock, glam metal was not a new theory. Like you said, T-Rex, Bowie, it had been done in the 70s, in the early 70s, and then this was sort of just a resurgence of something that had happened already in a different musical style. So anyway, that's about all I have to say.
Excellent.
Okay. All right, we're going to talk more about Van Halen in a little bit. So, but before we do that, let's go over to Pete Jones in the Frozen North. Pete, what have you got to say about glam metal?
Thank you, Reed. Good to see everybody again. This is a very personal time for me. I got out of college with my music degree in '85, and it wasn't a year or two later, I was forming my rock bands and was playing 6 nights a week in the clubs in Denver. I lived right through the middle of this, at the most intense and personal level. First of all, when I think about this era, I do have a sense, and completely self-confessed, of snobbery about what's going on here. To me, this is about hairspray, feminine makeup, outside writers, similar productions, sex first, music second, all, drugs and partying, all of which look, I'm not I'm not celibate, so I'm not stupid, but all of these things don't mean a damn thing to me. Music first for me, and it's always been that way. So I was already in an inherent conflict from the beginning. As we're going through the clubs with our band, and we were a classic rock band, and Reed, you so poignantly pointed out that there seemed to be 2 camps. There's the glam or the thrash. Well, me and my buddies didn't live in either one of them. And we were right down the middle. We were still into the real classic rock of the 70s, and we were playing Free and Bad Company and bands like that. And I will also say, and the image kind of speaks for itself, I'm nearly 6'3", I'm well over 200 pounds. Hairspray and spandex is not a good look. Let's just make that really clear. Okay? It's just not. And I am glad I can say that there are no closet photographs of me in a band. I'm going, hey, remember this era? Sorry, I don't have any, because I couldn't stand it. And we lost a lot of gigs in prominent clubs because we didn't look right. Nobody wanted to follow us on stage because we blew them off musically, but we couldn't get the gigs. So having said that, I look back at some of the bands, and you talked about 1983, and that is a good place to start because you can go through some of the more legacy bands and you can see very specifically what happens here. Kiss, of course, they take their makeup off, but they still look kind of heavy. So that's, you go from Lick It Up into Animalize, and all of a sudden, and this is why I mentioned the black part on the Motley, all of a sudden there's greens and yellows and oranges and pinks, and you're like, what? What happened there? Now, did the music completely change? Not as fast. And we said, I think as Nick said, if some of them adopted the look, but maybe not the musical part of it yet. Judas Priest, look at them in 84 on Defenders. They are the definition of metal. But by 86 in Turbo, they're all big poofy hair and guitar synths and completely different look, right? Even Ronnie Dio. We look at Sacred Heart into Dream Evil. His hair's all puffy. They've got more sequins on their stuff. Greg Giuffria's hair is this big. Greg Goldie, sorry, let me correct that. And then after 85, Dio's sales fall off the cliff. Heart completely changes. They don't look remotely like they used to in the 70s. Scorpions, they go from Love at First Sting to Savage Amusement. These are short period of time, a couple years. So we look at that and we're like, okay, well, what's going on? To me, the real glam era that I like to focus on really starts to happen about late 96, and by 90, late 89, early 90, things are off the cliff. And, if we look at 1986, top album, Slippery When Wet. Now, is Bon Jovi a glam band? They sure mark the box visually, right? There's no question about that. Their stuff's pretty poppy. It's a far cry from their debut, which I absolutely loved, but didn't take me long to jump ship. Almost 17 million copies worldwide. But who's right behind them in 96? Here's Metallica with Master of Puppets at 10 million, right? There's the other camp. Something's going, they're going in on the opposite sides of the railroad, looking at each other, waving who can sell the most stuff. 5150, Van Halen sells almost 7 million. Poison, 3 million too. Cinderella is now showing up with over 3 million. And Tired and True Ozzy is Ultimate Sin is at, 2 million plus. But then something seminal happens, and we haven't mentioned it yet. Part of the decline, I think, can really be attributed to one very specific event. The release of Appetite for Destruction. Because what happens here is that there is a popular backlash. These guys are dirty, nasty, grimy, dangerous. And what happens? Appetite has sold 30 plus million copies, right? But then who's right behind them? Def Leppard. Another band who's changed drastically from where they started to now where they are. But you can't argue the popularity. Hysteria sells 25 million plus on top of a Diamond one that came out when Pyromania came out. They're huge. Whitesnake's 87, almost 9 plus million worldwide. But that's a far cry visually from what Slide It In looked like just a couple years earlier. Totally different band. Everything is different.
So
Motley's,
true. Huge change. Yeah.
Girls, Girls, Girls. Crazy Nights. And so we can go on like that. So we were looking at 88, Bon Jovi, Metallica, Poison, Cinderella, Ozzy, Scorpions. The Scorpions changed. And all of a sudden, they're selling big again because Rhythm of Love, very popular song. It's kind of more poppy. You wouldn't confuse that for Love Drive. Or Animal Magnetism, right? We get to 89. Now it's all about Aerosmith. Pump comes out. We got Dr. Feelgood. Now we've got Skid Row. But you know what? Here's this album called Bleach. People weren't paying attention to it, even though it sells 2+ million worldwide. I think a lot of that is retro sales after Nevermind went crazy. Great White is still there. Tesla is there. We get to 90 when I think the things start changing. Now we've got AC/DC, Black Crowes. Poison is still tailing off the rest of their sales. But here's Facelift from Alice in Chains. Things are changing. And you mentioned MTV, and I think it's exceptionally important because we know that MTV, this is redundant and kind of a stupid obvious, it's a visual medium. The audio is secondary. It's about the visuals. And when you get to 87, you look at the bands who were in the highest rotations, and I looked up year-end numbers from MTV. Bon Jovi, Whitesnake, Heart, Whitesnake, Europe, Whitesnake, Poison, Europe, Motley, Cinderella, right? You get to 88, we've got Guns, Def Leppard, Aerosmith, Bon Jovi, Poison, Guns, Aerosmith, Def Leppard. So these bands are you've got 3 or 4 entries from GNR, you've got 3 or 4 entries from Poison. These bands are saturating this MTV market. They are on all the time. And I always go back to what Bruce Dickinson says during Live After Death, in between one of the songs. He goes, I don't get it. He says, he said, oh, heavy metal's dead. And yeah, but you sell out 4 nights at Long Beach. And he says, yeah, you're on MTV. You think you're a big fucking star and you can't sell out a toilet. He was right. Other than this very small group of bands, all of these other bands that get lumped into this, and it did become a parody, it was sign anybody who looked right. Who cares if they could play? This is Johnny Bravo, if you know the Brady Bunch episode. This is Johnny Bravo. You fit the suit. And if you look good and you can strut around and look like you weigh about 106 pounds wet, go for it. And we're going to sign you. And we're going to sign you because we just think the reward is going to be too good. Now, these record companies are not stupid. They're making so much money off that top tier of bands, they can, for a while, afford to sign and maybe not promote or get as much money, but they're just putting out as much product as they can. And when we look at album sales, and I won't go through all this, you can look them up. You go through, and I'm just going to touch on bands. LA Guns, go through 88 to 89, career's done. Brittany Fox, who's always listed in some kind of big influential glam thing. 1 gold certification in 88, disappeared by 89, done. I'm not saying this bands are good or bad. You decide on your own. I have my own preferences. Tesla was able to go a little bit later. They go through into 91, but you go through Skid Row, you just go through all of these bands, and they weren't as big as we think they were. And they certainly didn't last a long time. You couple that with the sheer stupidity. These videos became so ridiculous. They were so annoying. And the overexposure and the constant beating this stuff into your head. And it just had to stop. And it was a completely incestual way. They all just started feeding on each other. There was not enough to go around. And next thing you know, this guy's dropping, that band falls apart. This one's fighting about this. And now, as with all trends, as was pointed out, something different has to happen. And it always does. And the thing about popular music, and I'm an enormous classical fan, is that in the popular culture, trends change way faster than they do in other styles of music. Jazz trends carried for much longer periods of time. Classical ones would sometimes go 100 years before they would change styles. Different world, different times. But this popular kind of music that was going on in the late 80s, and again, these bands, as much as they think they were selling, were slivers compared to the Phil Collins and the Whitneys and the people who were selling 10 times what they were selling. So it's not like they were the dominant charts. They weren't. And if they were so great, MTV had to relegate one show a week, late night on a Saturday, to give you the videos we can't show you during, or we don't show you during the week because it's our metal time. How popular really are you? And yeah, the Seattle sound stuff came in, but it was a whole amalgamation of excess, stupidity, and I will say this category, in my personal opinion, from when rock and roll starts in the 50s through up until rap starts to become prominent, I think this is the least talented, most throwaway period in rock history. That's my view.
And you are welcome to it, sir.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Well, lots to unpack there. Okay, so where to begin? Well, let's go back. What all am I going to cover here? Let's go back to glam. Let's take it back to glam again. 1973. As much as the term glam gets thrown around, many artists that get included in glam, and like all musical movements, every artist who has ever been included in a musical movement, until you get to heavy metal, many heavy metal artists love being called heavy metal, except for the original heavy metal artists, Black Sabbath and Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin, all of whom hated being referred to as heavy metal.
Right.
Judas Priest loved being heavy metal. They were the first artist who embraced being heavy metal. But glam was Alice Cooper. Alice will tell you vociferously that he invented the glam look and that Bowie stole it from him. In fact, I've read that quote from him multiple times. Something that Bowie was like, who? Oh, yeah, we saw Alice. I don't know what he's talking about. His dress sense sucked, which I thought was hilarious. You're talking about Mark Bolan? Mark Bolan accidentally invented glam. I think he has a much cleaner claim to it than Alice Cooper does, by going on top of the Pops, which was in black and white on TV, under the bright lights, and he wanted to stand out. So just before he went on stage, the apocrypha is he took a little glitter and splashed it on his face before he went on so that he would stand out on camera. And boom, instantly and accidentally, you have invented glam. Wow. You have David Bowie. David Bowie was a performance artist. He wore that look for 2 albums and then moved on. You have Sweet. Sweet was a bubblegum artist that they were sequined up for 1 album. So the glam artist will tell you that was 1 year. Nick said album cycle. Remember how fast album cycles went in the 1970s. Artists were releasing 2 albums a year. So functionally, glam was 1973, arguably, maybe into 1974. So, and it did not translate over well into the United States, no matter what Alice Cooper thinks. They did wear some sparkly outfits on stage, but by 1973, the original Alice Cooper band is already breaking up, and Alice is going off as a solo act, and he has his whole cabaret thing, which you can hardly call glam at that point. So let's fast forward up to 1978 when we get to Van Halen, because if you're going to go, as many of us music nerds do, you start talking about proto this and proto that, and if we're going to like the Stooges get included as proto punk, well, Van Halen are clearly proto glam. They did not have the look, but they were the sound that the first wave of glam was chasing. Sort of. Because they were absolute contemporaries of Quiet Riot. As much as Eddie fought against the idea that Randy was his contemporary, and I have read so much trash talking from Eddie, and frankly, I always thought that was way beneath him to be talking shit about Randy Rhoads, who never copied him. Good grief, those two could not be more stylistically different, and the man should have been above that kind of talk. I mean, he was Eddie Van Halen. He didn't need to say bad things about other people. Good grief. He's dead now. They're both dead. Don't even know why I'm still harping on that. Anyway, Quiet Riot and Van Halen were absolutely coming up at the same time. And Quiet Riot, Randy Rhoads loved glam rock. He loved David Bowie's glam years. He loved, oh my gosh, all of a sudden I can't remember. I'm not going to remember it. It's Bebop Deluxe. He loved Bebop Deluxe, which were kind of another glam group that doesn't get mentioned very often. So they had a lot of glam influences in Quiet Riot, although he leaves and joins Ozzy before Van Halen comes out with Van Halen 1. Now, it's important. I looked up. One of the things I love about the Recording Industry Association of America is that you can look at the history, not just of the certifications, but of the timing of the certifications. So if you look at Van Halen 1, their first album goes gold and platinum very, very fast. They do not certify again until 1984. Keep that date in mind. Van Halen 2 goes gold and platinum very fast. They do not certify again until 1984. Fair warning, Women and Children First, they don't even go platinum. They don't certify again until 1984. Van Halen cannot break into the mainstream. Those are very big albums, but they can't break through that heavy metal glass ceiling. Quiet Riot, their contemporary, their rival, frankly, the inferior band, took a glam song, and this is one of the reasons why it's glam metal. They took a Slade cover, which they didn't even want to do. It was their producer's idea to do a Slade cover. Slade, unquestionably a glam band, but that song is so catchy, and Quiet Riot performs it in such a catchy manner. That drum start, Slade didn't do anything like that on their original. That's all, I can't remember the drummer, Frankie Banali. That's all Frankie Banali on the drums. That song goes to number 5, which was higher than Van Halen had ever charted at that point. And their album goes to number 1, which was higher than Van Halen had ever charted. The next Van Halen album that comes out after Quiet Riot breaks that glass ceiling goes to number 1. So I would argue that Quiet Riot is what enables Van Halen to take that leap. Now, at that point, they simply leapfrog Quiet Riot and leave them in the dust. Quiet Riot falls away like the booster on the space shuttle, and Quiet Riot takes off into space.
Right.
And poor Quiet Riot are frankly, functionally never heard from again. So at that point, you will always have, as Pete is saying, you have the big bands and you have the hangers-on. And in glam metal, you really have 2 phases. My continuing hypothesis is that every musical movement lasts 4 to 6 years. The amount of time that Americans are in junior high and high school. When you get out of high school, you're looking for something new, or you stop listening to music. When I was in college, I knew very few people that listened to music. And the people that did listened to what they listened to in high school. So at that point, the new kids that are coming in, they don't want what the people that graduated listened to. If you're 13 years old, you're not listening to what the 19-year-olds are listening to. You want your new thing, right? So that first wave of people, they are influenced by Led Zeppelin. They're influenced by Queen. They're influenced by Deep Purple. They're influenced by Van Halen. That wave, your Rats, your Dawkins, your Motley Crues, I would argue real heavy metal bands, real American heavy metal bands, they're putting out good, solid American hard rock, heavy metal, fantastic musicianship. Not from Motley Crue. Frankly, I never liked Motley Crue. But good, Warren DeMartini, that dude could play. George Lynch from Dawkins, I mean, the drummers were they all wanted to be John Bonham. The guitar players were all shredders. You had to have a shredder to compete in that space. So all the bands were about their guitar hero, the singer out front, and a drummer that wanted to be John Bonham. Those were the three things that you had to have to compete in that space. Then you get to 87, 88. And let's not forget that when Appetite for Destruction came out, it was a failure for about 9 months because they couldn't figure out who to market that album to. And it's so weird to me that it succeeded when they sold it to metalheads. Because by this time, the separation between glam and thrash had happened. So they were trying to market Guns N' Roses over to, I don't know, glam people, rock people. No one was biting. Welcome to the Jungle had died. It wasn't going anywhere. So they pushed it towards metalheads, and metalheads embraced it. And after that, Guns N' Roses just took off. But it went for, I think, here I've got the actual numbers here. I'm so sorry, people. Give me just a second, please. So it came out in July of 87. It was certified gold in February of 88. So that's 7 months to go gold. Certified platinum in April of 88. But after that, it's double platinum in July of 88. I mean, once it hits, it just goes, again, off like a rocket. And here's the important thing. It never stops selling.
Right. And
at that point, Guns N' Roses are influenced by Aerosmith and AC/DC. And they used to refer to Slash as the anti-guitar hero. Slash can't shred. I'm not saying he can't play guitar. I like the way Slash plays guitars. I think he's got some great solos, but Slash is not a shredder. You put Slash up against Warren DeMartini, and Warren's going to run circles around it, just in terms of speed and fluidity and dexterity. He was not an 80s style guitar player. He was a 70s style guitar player. And then suddenly you've got all of these copycat bands. You've got your Faster Pussycats, and like you say, your Tufts and your Pretty Boy Floyds, and all of these guys that are like, well, we couldn't compete with your Rats and your Dawkins because the musicianship on those bands was way up here. But we can maybe squeak in your AC/DC, your Aerosmith. We grew up playing Aerosmith and AC/DC. We can maybe swim in those waters. And it was about the look. And Nick, I love the mention of the AIDS epidemic because those bands were all about sex.
Yeah.
It was all about sex. And that was no longer, the promiscuousness was no longer cool. I remember when Kiss Asylum came out in 1985, the rumor was that album was going to be called Condemnation.
Yep.
Because condoms were such a hot topic at that point for the first time ever.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think this is a really fascinating thing, too. If you're not familiar, grunge got kicked off so much earlier than people who aren't grunge aficionados think. It really got started in the late 80s, about 87, 88. One of the first proto-grunge albums is from Green River called Rehab Doll. Maybe whoever edits this, a lot of times they put up my videos with no editing. But if this does get edited, put up the cover for Rehab Doll and look at the guys on the front of it. Tell me they don't look exactly like a glam metal band. Now, the music's a lot dirtier than a glam metal band. Then Green River breaks up and becomes, half of Green River becomes Mother Love Bone.
Mm-hmm.
And Andee Wood, the singer of Mother Love Bone, who dies of a heroin overdose and inspires the Alice in Chains song Wood, he was famous for including glam elements in his show. And this is 1988. So glam was part of grunge before grunge gave up that part of its identity and became known for dressing down and the flannels and all of that. So that whole identity, they were still owning that in 1988. But like you're saying, it had simply shifted as we move into 1990. And I will always fight back against the narrative that so many people simply roll heavy metal into grunge killed metal. I'm like, grunge did not kill metal. Metallica came out, the Black Album, which is technically Metallica, and we're going to talk about that in a video in a couple of weeks. Stay tuned for that. Maybe it'll be out before this. I never know when these videos go up. Came out 6 weeks before Nevermind. Just 6 weeks. And it went gangbusters and is the biggest selling album of the Soundscan era. And we're going to talk about Soundscan here in just a second, so keep peeled for that. And Ozzy Osbourne's No More Tears came out 1 week after Nevermind, and it sold double platinum on release. It took 2 years or 4 years or 6 years to sell double platinum. When it came out after this bomb that supposedly destroyed heavy metal, Ozzy Osbourne sold double platinum. And this was after Dirt had come out, or excuse me, Facelift had come out from Alice in Chains. Dirt was about to come out. I saw Alice in Chains on the Dirt tour open for Ozzy Osbourne just before that album came out. Fantastic concert. I think Motorhead opened for them. Great tour. So there was a lot of heavy metal as grunge was really getting going. And that's not even talking about alternative metal and new metal, which are coming down the pike. The 1990s were huge for heavy metal. But like you say, what it did was it killed off those shit bands that were around the periphery. And anytime, and I'm sorry, guys, if anybody who was in a band, man, I am so sorry, but if you're one of the lower rent bands in a genre, and especially if you jump on a bandwagon at the end of a cycle, you're going to get ground under the wheels.
Yeah. You're going to get cleared out. Yeah, you're going to get cleared out.
You've got to, if you're going to be a bandwagon jumper, you've got to jump on at the beginning of the course, and then maybe it'll take you along with it, like Skid Row. And I like Skid Row, sort of. I like half of Skid Row. I like their first album, about half of it, and I like Subhuman. Slave to the Grind didn't do much for me. But if you're in that last year of that 4 to 6 year cycle and you jump onto the bandwagon, then you're toast. And the record companies are still throwing money at you, but you're a walking zombie at that point, because you're not going to get tours. People are not going to buy your records, and the kids are going in there. They think you're old hat already. So what is the point? Now, one more thing, Soundscan. So until 1991, remember, all album sales are based on how many records are shipped to record stores. It's and it's a guess. So if you go back to the 1970s and they're going, okay, we have a platinum album, that is somebody's best guess for how many albums got sold. Nobody was keeping tallies. It was very political. It was incredibly corrupt. Bands would pay money to the RIAA. Sorry, let me not accuse specific agencies or entities. People
allegedly
things would be done to influence the results, and perhaps people do not necessarily sell as many albums as they are certified to have sold. In 1991, Nielsen Soundscan goes live. And for years, it didn't even include the biggest record retailers in America. But Soundscan used barcodes. It scanned because they scanned barcodes, point of sale systems, and counted actual merchandise sales. So for the first time ever, it actually tracked what people were buying. And what they discovered was it made the music industry do this. What people thought was selling like hotcakes wasn't. It made people realize that actually heavy metal was a lot more popular than people thought. And so when you see something that's post 1991 and it says it sold 2 million copies, that means 2 million copies actually went into somebody's shopping cart and somebody paid money for them. And that's a much more reliable and impressive number. But it also means everybody sold less records because those are real sales. So if you look at a record like Metallica selling 18 million copies of the Black Album in 1991, they probably would have estimated that at like 40 million in the 1980s. I mean, that is incredibly impressive. Whereas Def Leppard sold 500,000 copies of Slang. Well, that's a gold record. It went to number 12. And yes, for Def Leppard, that is an incredible downturn in their fortunes. For 99% of bands, that would be the best success they had ever had, right? It's just that compared to 15 million copies of Hysteria, what is that, right?
Right.
So there's the downturn of heavy metal for you, or of glam metal. And yes, I'm going to throw in Joe Elliott. I am including your band in glam metal. Eat it.
I don't think he'd take too offense to that.
No, and I had Def Leppard in my notes too. I never said anything about them, but I had them in there too because obviously glam was their big. They loved glam rock,
right.
Or at least Joe Elliott did.
Well, there are a couple real interesting points here. I think there's one thing I want to touch on, and then the second one, real quick follow up. One of the things we left out is the stereotype of this era. It's the look, it's the videos, it's everything else. But there was one element that we didn't touch on here. And it seemed to be something that if you didn't have in your repertoire, you were left behind. And it was the power ballad.
Oh yeah. How can we forget?
And you cannot talk about this without talking about the power ballad. Everybody had to have one. Everybody. Kiss had to have Forever. I mean, you could pick your bands. You could go on and on and on. Everybody had to have them. And part of the danger here is that the currents are so strong and so sweeping here that there could be the danger, and it happened more than once, where a band gets lumped into the category simply because their hair is longer than their shoulders. Mm-hmm. Or they presented a power ballad that people go, see? They're, and what it can do is it can misrepresent the bands. You'd already mentioned, Tom, that poor Janie, he just hated it. He hated Cherry Pie. He couldn't stand it. He wished he'd never wrote it. It ruined his life. He hated it.
Yeah.
And is Mr. Big their ballad? I want to be with you. That's not Mr. Big. Is Extreme more than words? No. Is Queensryche Silent Lucidity? No. Was Kiss Beth? No. Now, I'm not saying they're good or bad songs. That's your individual judgment. But what I'm saying is bands get lumped, and when the bigger bands started to latch on to the reality, and Phil Collins said this more than a few times with Def Leppard, when they would ask him about the change in style and how the band has changed, he goes, look, we could have stayed the same and we'd be in the Ozzy world. 2 million, 2.5 million a year, which is nothing to sneeze at. That's a great career. He said, but if we get the women on board, we're in the 6, 7, who knows, million range. And that's the difference. In my household, it is so measurable, it's not funny. My wife jumped on the band when I was jumping off. And it was always a connector song that did it. And it was always more of a ballad or something like that. She'd latch onto it, and then she would follow their career when I was going, I'm done. Because I couldn't get it any further past that. So I think that's a very key element. And once it starts to become so copycat, and the thing is ballads can be great. I love ballads. Purple did ballad. I mean, they can be really well done and they can be great musically, structurally, and everything else. But when they become so formulated And here's a black and white video with somebody in a hat and a tear in their eye. And it's like, oh, the breakup person who's walking out of the house because they got kicked out. I mean, I stop. It just got to be so ridiculous that you just want to,
Yeah. Aerosmith became the king of that. I mean, they just one after another.
Right.
But Joe Perry said, when you make the choice to live in the world of hits, you sell your soul to the devil. He said that. He knew it.
He knew it.
But they'd been broke and irrelevant for a long time. And this was their way to get out. But it went back to what I said originally. What do you got to do? To bring in outside writers who write stuff that you don't normally write on your own. And you've got very strong-minded record guys. And we could have a separate show about, like a Kolodner or somebody like that who comes in and goes, no, that's not it. We need it to be this and the band just goes, okay. Because we're broke and we're stupid and we can't get back on it on our own. So,
well, to be fair, though, Kolodner was right, which is one of the reasons why people hate him so much. He was right.
In what context, though, Reed? For me,
they wanted money, and he made money for them.
Okay, from them, yes. But I always got the sense at the end of the day, especially from somebody like Perry, he would rather be respected as a musician long-term than to say, oh, yeah, I was the guy who wrote, or I played on Love in an Elevator.
He says that his actions say differently.
Maybe so. Maybe so.
I'm sure you tell your kids, believe what people do, not what people say.
But what I've also said is that sales is not a referendum on quality. It's a referendum on popularity.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you, but I think he cries himself to sleep on that bed of fat cash, and I don't feel too bad for him.
Yeah.
You go back to, when you listen to Cherry Pie, if you listen to the rest of the record, they were going to call it Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Right.
And holy crud, if that song just doesn't crush. And a lot of the other stuff's on it, but you never get to it because the singles group, the people who just like the hit, they want to hear Cherry Pie, and they ignore the rest. And
again, that is Laney's story after the fact. I mean, I get it. Life is full of regrets. Who knows what would have happened? You know what? He wasn't going to compete with Metallica regardless. No. It's not like that was an entire album of Uncle Tom's Cabins.
No, it wasn't.
He didn't have that in him. All right, we've chatted a lot. We're getting over an hour, so I'm going to call it there. Except I'm going to give the man with the staring shirt the last word. Nick, you have anything else you want to throw in on that? What is that, by the way? Why is your clothing staring at me?
That's Owen. You guys ever see Planes, Trains, and Automobiles?
Planes, Trains, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. That's Owen. That's Owen. Love the scene. My daughter got it for me as a gift, so I'm into Owen now again. I'm revisiting Owen. Two other bands that came out around this 89-90 time period that sort of signaled sort of this shift away from that music, Black Crowes and Nine Inch Nails. Big bands that sort of were doing a lot of business. One other thing, and I throw this out there because we didn't talk about it. I don't know how much it influenced the masses, but it may have influenced the people who are making decisions. And that is the release of the documentary movie, Decline of Western Civilization 2. It made these bands look absurd, ridiculous, a joke. Maybe bands who saw that documentary, I got to get away from this, but it made the genre itself look totally played out and absurd. And I remember at the time, I never saw the thing because I don't know where it was playing. It might have been you rented on VHS, but they would play clips, whether it was on MTV or somewhere else in the popular media. And I just thought it was just not a good look for that type of music in those bands. It was really shitty. So anyway, I throw that out there. But yeah, I love the opinions, and you guys offered something that I learned something today. So it was great.
All right. Well, we're going to be talking about Decline of Western Civilization Part 2 on Peter Kerr's Rock Daydream Nation coming up.
Yes, we will.
I don't know when that's going to be on. By the way, I was at the theater watching that movie when it came out, and I will say that This is a commentary on metalhead culture, perhaps, but no matter how ridiculous it made us look in that movie, everyone in that theater loved it. And probably half of them went home and got sloshed out of their minds on cheap vodka and drowned in their swimming pools. And I'm just going to leave it there. Hey, this has been the Contrarians. We've been talking about the rise and fall of glam metal. You know what? None of this stuff is cut and dry. We're talking about a period of about 13 years. It's just a bunch of opinions. We're nerds. We love talking about music. We would love you to join us. Comment down below. Tell us where we're wrong. Tell us where we're right. Buy t-shirts. Grow your hair long in your 50s. It's the best. Retire early. It's also the best. Sorry, that's just a plug. I love being retired. And we hope to see you on another Contrarians video in the very near future. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Panel, Tom, Nick, Pete, thanks, guys. We'll see you very soon.